Another really negative side effect that can occur if we have a layer 2 topological loop is a broadcast storm. Remember what a broadcast frame looks like? That's where the destination MAC address in hexadecimal is all Fs. Well, that MAC address is never going to be learned by a switch. So what does a switch do when it receives an unknown unicast or a broadcast frame? It floods it, doesn't it? It sends it out of all of the other ports, all of the ports on the switch other than the port on which the frame was received. In our case, PCA is sending a broadcast frame out on that top network segment. That's going to be flooded out of the bottom port on both switches. Poor PCB gets a couple of copies of that, and it floods back through the switches, and PCA gets a couple of copies of the frame as well, and this just repeats itself. We have a broadcast storm. PCs A and B, they're being flooded with these broadcasts. They're having to stop and take a look at each of these frames coming in, which is preventing them from doing their normal duties. And this can really increase the processor utilization on these switches as well. And it can make the devices attached to these network segments pretty much unusable. As a real-world story, this happened to me one time when I was working down at Walt Disney World in Florida. It was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and that's a prime time when people are checking into their hotel. And we get a call that guests are unable to check in at the Yacht and Beach Club resorts. Those are resorts close to Epcot, and we got in a company van. We go over to Epcot, and there in Future World, a lot of people don't know that there's a partial tunnel system underneath Epcot. We go under Future World, that's where the Cisco gear was, and we take a look at our Cisco Catalyst switch, and sure enough, the processor utilization was suspiciously high. And after a little bit of troubleshooting, we determined that we had a spanning tree issue. And we had a broadcast storm on the network, and that was preventing guests from checking into their resorts. And that was a pretty big deal because when you check into the resort, you get this little card, they call it your Key to the World card, and that's the card you use to buy merchandise, to get food, to get into the parks, to get into your room. And the resorts were unable to create these cards because we had a broadcast storm going on. And to tell you how that story ended, once we discovered it was a spanning tree issue, what we did, we simply disconnected one of the redundant links going into the switch. We thought that it was better to have a non-redundant yet functional network than a redundant but non-functional network. And then somebody came back later in the day to minimize impact on the users, and they swapped out the supervisor engine. But I can tell you from personal experience that a broadcast storm can bring a network to its knees. The great news is the spanning tree protocol can come to the rescue. That's what we're going to see next. Think of a tree that you might find in nature. If you look at the branches of that tree, do those branches loop back on themselves? Probably not. Same thing here in the network with a spanning tree. A spanning tree is a topology that is loop-free. We're not going to have branches looping back on themselves. And if you also consider that tree in nature, at the base of the tree we have a root system. Same thing here, we have a root bridge out of which this spanning tree topology is radiating. And we want to be able administratively to determine and influence which switch is acting as the root bridge. If we just plug a bunch of switches together, and I've seen this happen, we might have a suboptimal path. We might be forcing traffic to flow through a really old 10 meg switch as an example. We don't want to let spanning tree just happen. We want to influence it. And to do that, we need to be able to look at a topology and determine right now who is the root bridge and which of these ports are forwarding and which of these ports are blocking. After all, if every port was forwarding, that could cause that layer 2 topological loop that we don't want. The first question that we ask is, who is the root bridge? What is the base of this spanning tree? And the root bridge is a single bridge or switch in our networks in a spanning tree topology that has the lowest bid. It has the lowest bridge ID. The bridge ID is made up of a bridge priority that we can administratively configure and a MAC address. By default on our Cisco Catalyst switches have a default priority of 32.768. And if we just leave them at their default priorities, then the MAC address becomes the tiebreaker. Whichever switch has the lowest MAC address becomes the root bridge. Let's take a look at this topology on screen. These are actual MAC addresses from a topology that I have set up right now. And both switches, switch A and switch B, they both have their default priorities of 32.768. And the first question we want to ask is, Who is the root bridge? Since the priorities are a tie, we need to look to the MAC address to see who's the root bridge. If we look at the first 3 hexadecimal digits of each switch, I think we can figure it out. Switch A has 001 as its first 3 hexadecimal digits in its MAC address. Switch B has 000. That's lower than 001, so that means switch B is going to be our root bridge. Great, now we know that this is the base of our spanning tree. However, we do not yet know which ports are forwarding traffic and which ports might be blocking traffic. We need to define the different port states. First of all, let's take a look at the root port. A root port is a port on a non-root bridge. Switch B is our root bridge. It will have 0 root ports. Switch A, however, is a non-root bridge. It will have 1 and only 1 root port, and it's the port that's closest to the root bridge in terms of cost. And cost, by default, is dependent on the interface speeds. Notice that switch A has a couple of paths to get back to switch B. The top path, the top network segment, is running at 100 megabits per second, and as you can see from the table on screen, that has an STP port cost of 19. The bottom path, network segment 2, it's running at 10 megabits per second. That has a cost of 100. 19 is less than 100. That means it's less costly for switch A to get to switch B if it goes out of Fast Ethernet 1/0/1. It's a cost of 19 as opposed to a cost of 100, so Fast Ethernet 1/0/1 on switch A, that becomes our root port. Next, we ask, who are the designated ports? And a designated port exists on every network segment. It's the port on a segment that's closest to the root bridge in terms of cost. And here we have a very basic topology. We only have 2 switches, so it's going to be very easy to figure out who the designated ports are because we cannot get closer to the root bridge than on the root bridge. In this case, both network segment 1 and network segment 2, the ports on those segments that are closest to the root bridge are the ports on the root bridge. Gigabit 0/9 on switch B and gigabit 0/10 on switch B. And we look around at any port that is left in our topology. Fast Ethernet 1/0/2 on switch A in our case. If it's not a disabled port, in other words, if it's not administratively down, and it's not, that means that it is a non-designated port, which means it's blocking traffic. This is giving us our loop-free topology. We're not going to have a loop because production traffic is not going to be flowing into or out of Fast Ethernet 1/0/2 on switch A.